So a great question came up in our Q&A about perspective. This is so important when we're talking about two-dimensional art, right? Flat surfaces, painting, drawing, prints, even photography, where the two-dimensional surface seems to disappear in a sense because we believe we are seeing something three-dimensional. So here, this is actually a flat screen. If you're using the print textbook, it's a flat page with flat lines that read as if we have a box with depth, where we have a foreground, a middle ground, a background, where things go back in an imaginary space. That's an illusion. It's a trick. Artists learned how to do that trick, and there are lots of ways to do it, of different degrees of convincing power. So overlapping, diminution, these are pretty simple. Vertical perspective, and they're probably not as convincing as divergent perspective, intuitive perspective, and linear perspective. Because in these versions of perspective, you really still have a kind of flat frontal box with a triangle. It looks like a rectangle with a triangle. It doesn't look all that deep. In order to get depth, artists work with intersecting lines at different angles. Those angled intersecting lines, those diagonals, are called orthogonals. And those are used in every one of these systems: divergent perspective, intuitive perspective, and linear perspective. The most convincing and consistent of all of them is linear perspective. It gets invented in the 1400s in Italy, where a great artist, Brunelleschi, figured out that if you have a certain system for mathematically measuring every line, every one of these orthogonals, which are going at a diagonal and they're intersecting at an imaginary single point, and they're intersecting with these horizontals, if you measure them systematically, you can make all of the figures have proportionate consistency, and you can make the space seem deep and truly convincing. So this diagram, when it's showing you how orthogonals work to create linear perspective, it's showing you how an artist uses a set of lines, a horizon line, these orthogonal angled lines, and vanishing points where the lines seem to meet. The way a road, if you look way down a highway, if you're driving through the desert or something and you see way off into the distance, the sides of the road seem to converge together off into the distance. That's because of the eye, the eye's limits of perception, and artists play with that to make their illusion. So divergent perspective uses the orthogonals, those angled lines, but they're not meeting like a road where seeming to off in the distance narrow to a point. Instead of narrowing to a point, they actually widen. And so what the authors are doing here is they're showing ways that artists worked to make a sense of depth perception before Brunelleschi invented linear perspective. So they often would be working with orthogonal lines, but the lines, they hadn't figured out that having them meet in a certain mathematically calculated way was the most convincing. They were sort of doing a little bit of a guesswork and a rough estimate. And that's what intuitive perspective is, where they have the sense that they want the lines to meet, but they're not doing the actual math that Brunelleschi did to make the lines meet perfectly. So here's a wonderful painting that was made in ancient Rome. So it's also from Italy, but it's Italy in 50 BCE, so more than 1400 years before one-point linear perspective was invented. And it's a great example of intuitive perspective because you can see that the artist is very accomplished at making it feel like this architecture, this detailed architecture, which is sort of ancient Roman style of city architecture, that this structure has a front plane, and then this is the side plane going back, and we feel like this building is off into the distance, and we understand that this slanted line means it's receding into the distance. However, none of this is actually consistently ordered around a single vanishing point the way Perugino's is, where now everything is consistently ordered around the point where these orthogonals converge. Not so here. But that doesn't mean this is less than. It doesn't mean it's a failure or not as good as. It means that working with intuitive perspective, the artists accomplished what they wanted, what they needed. And there's a real playful sense of push and pull in the different sense of where everything is in space, different points in space, from the front to the back.